Thank you, Incos, for putting on the panel. I'm going to share my screen. I have a few slides to just kind of organize a talk and share on the back end if anybody's interested. So let me share that screen for a second. All right, good to go, Kathy? Thumbs up.
Yes.
All right. So I just wanted to give a brief overview of kind of some aspects of the art and science of polling analysis and do it within the time limit, of course. But some of the major points about why we do polls get missed when you pay too much attention to the media narratives. The first thing to keep in mind is that the reason we have polls and surveys around elections and we try and understand voting behavior is because we don't collect racial ethnic data of registered voters across the United States. In many states, mostly those that have civil rights acts, history of civil rights act violations, were required to keep that kind of information up to a certain point, and now they've been released from that. But most of the voter registration data does not come with racial ethnic data, and so we have to rely on public opinion polls and surveys to help us understand how the electorate is behaving and what are the reasons behind voting behavior. Now, you might see in the news that there are many different narratives about polling error and polls being broken because they're not getting elections correct. But in reality, we're doing better at polling than we've ever done. You can see from the, and I'll just kind of point to it, you can see from this trend that over the last 70 years or so, we've improved our ability to get national polls accurate. We have more issues at the state level because more kinds of error come into play. So the graphic on the right side shows 2016, where we have the most comprehensive presidential election data right now. And you can see that as you move from the left side of the chart to the right side, not only do you see a decreasing gap in the estimates, but you see the little shading area around the lines also decreasing. What that means is as you collect more and more data around an election, you get closer and closer to what the actual estimate is. When people see that polls get it wrong or polls have gotten it wrong, they're thinking about it the wrong way. One poll is just one data point in a distribution of data. And so you should expect that out of 100 polls, about 5% of the time, they'll get it wrong in some way or another. And that's just due to sampling error. So the key thing to remember is, yes, there are challenges with polls. They're not perfect, but they do have very small amounts of error when we look at the national electorate. So my main point, and I've been asked to talk about this a little bit by Sekou, is to talk about the margin of error, and that the thing to keep in mind is that the margin of error is only the error that's due to sampling. It's only error due to sampling size. Sampling error has a pretty straightforward formula, and it makes some basic assumptions about what you're trying to do within a certain level of confidence. So as your N size increases, your sample size increases for any given poll, your margin of error decreases. And usually the margin of error assumes that you have a 95% confidence interval. So this is pretty much known. You can plug it into most calculators and find the margin of error. For example, if you're interested in a 3% margin of error, you can either look at this chart or you can plug in the data, and it pretty much tells you that as you increase your sample size to 1,000, you reduce your error from almost 30, 40% down to about 3 percentage points. Now, you'll also notice that this line never reaches zero, because no matter how much data you collect, if you're surveying, if you're sampling, you're going to always have error. So you can never get to zero error, but as you increase your sample size, you can reduce that error. The thing to keep in mind also is that even if you do have a relatively small margin of error that represents your survey, it doesn't mean that your analysis has the same margin of error. You can see from this kind of graphic, this is an Ipsos Reuters poll from late October. And you can see as you move along the line to who you're trying to understand, whether it's Democratic voters or independent voters, you're decreasing your sample size, which means you're increasing your margin of error. So if someone is saying something about Democratic registered voters, that error is not the same as the error that exists for the study. So in many cases, when the media talks about who's voting for whom and for what reasons, that error that they're reporting is for the study, but the error for the actual analysis that explains why and what's going on is actually much larger. And that's something that most journalists don't really take into consideration or understand. So one example, of course, is that when we look at point estimates between candidates, here you have a Democratic candidate at 43% and a Republican candidate at 48%. That 5 percentage point gap, you can see the estimates overlap. These dots in the middle are called point estimates, and the little wings around them are called the margin of error or the confidence interval for that point estimate. In statistics, we can look at whether or not two confidence intervals overlap to see if they're different. But in polling, we take things a little bit more serious. There's actually some science behind this, and we're asking a different question when we look at the margin or the gap between two candidates. So looking at the estimate for the candidate is not the same as looking at the difference in the estimates between the two candidates. Those actually have two different formulas. So while you may see a small margin of error due to high sample, it doesn't mean that that small margin translates to the actual interpretation of the data. And I just provide a few examples. Each of the different types of error have different formulas. They're all in your basic textbooks, or you can enter them in different calculators. But if we're looking at the margin of error for a study and we find that Biden has 52%, we can actually say that his actual population support is anywhere between 49 and 55. But if we're going to compare his number across another response category, here you see a 10 percentage point gap. And if you look at the 3.1% error, you're going to miss. You're going to say, oh, these things are different. They're outside of the margin. But now we're asking a different question when we compare these two. We're asking, is that 10 percentage point gap statistically different from zero, right? And that's a different question. And then if we're trying to look across different studies to look at a trend and say, okay, this survey was done last week, and hey, we see Biden now has 2 percentage points more. Is that statistically different? Well, it has a completely different margin of error, as does an estimate for a different candidate. So you have a single estimate for a single question. You have 2 points within a single question for an estimate. And then you have different surveys, and you're looking across those surveys. So your margin of error is very important for understanding your data, but it's just based on sample size, and the kind of error that you're looking at differs depending on your question. The second point I want to make is that just having a larger n size doesn't mean your data is more accurate. Your n size is just statistical, it's just numerical, it's mathematical. What we care about when it comes to accuracy is actually weighting. We want to make sure the data are representative of the larger population. So the exit poll data becomes public after about a year or so. So we can look back at 2016, and we can see that in 2016, the exit poll data talked to about 3,157 Black respondents. That's about 12.8% of that data collection. But when we weight the data, that is, we try and ensure that the data are representative by counting some responses more than others so that it's actually representative, you see that the percentage in the sample actually goes down. It doesn't mean that it's less accurate because the sample is going down. It's actually becoming more representative statistically. So in any exit poll or any election polling data, the margin of error is one thing, but so is the weighting element. And this is kind of a more recent conversation after the election, was whether or not Trump increased his support among African-American males. And so what I did was went back and looked at 2016 to see if the increase in support from 13 percentage points is what they reported in 2016 up to 19 percentage points was actually statistically different. And when we look at it, we can see that part of the difference in the estimate is actually just due to weighting. So when you're thinking about who's in the exit poll or polling data, a part of that is understanding how weighting operates, and it can change the estimates that we make on the back end. And just to be clear, right now, just based on the exit poll data, there wasn't a significant increase among African-American males in terms of support for Trump. They had an overlapping margin of error, essentially. And the last point I want to make is that we can do more as academics and a general subgroup population about getting engaged with polling. I think a lot of our thinking about surveys comes from our being in the discipline of political science, which is not a bad thing. But sociology, communication, statistics, political science, psychology are all a part of the broader understanding of public opinion and survey methodology. And we can, if we come to the table, we can actually bring more understanding of what kinds of questions are being asked. Right now, a lot of the exit poll data we find for African Americans is relatively benign. The questions aren't interesting. We don't learn very much. If we were at the table, we would say, hey, you should maybe be thinking about these things that matter to the group as well. So I want to just point very quickly to some of the inclusion efforts that are going on in other associations that are being supported by broader organizations like Gallup and the Pew Research Center. So I just want to make those three brief points, and I look forward to talking about it even more.